We'll now move on to the second topic on the participation of victims in peace negotiations. During this intervention, we'll hear from His Excellency Sergio Jaramillo, who is an architect of transitional justice in Colombia, and he will give us an inspirational overview of the Colombian success. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Sana Center and Peace Forum. We were really delighted to have the Sana Center recently in Colombia, along with some friends from Deeproot, and it's very, very nice to meet again. And thanks to the Dutch Embassy and to Bart for this really excellent initial remarks. I wanted to make 3 or 4 points in our brief time, but before that, I want to say just 1 or 2 things about the importance of what you're doing here today, because as Bart rightly said, these efforts of civil society are really hugely, hugely important to put these themes on the table, to keep awareness, to push the agenda forward. And anything we can do to help with that, we're there to help. I'm particularly encouraged by the things we've done recently in the case of Colombia, which is to begin to have these exchanges and visits. And thanks again to the Dutch Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, without whom we couldn't have done this. But I think this connection of experience, it's difficult to imagine 2 countries that are more different than Yemen and Colombia. And yet, a lot of the experiences are similar. And dear Shala, who's with us today, or Yasmin, can tell you that, and everyone in Colombia was very impressed by their questions. And that was because they're very intelligent people, but also because their experience somehow mirrors some of the stuff that's also going on in a country as far away as Colombia. So let's keep connecting, because I think that really helps. And my last point is simply, and this is maybe the main lesson of Colombia, because when you get to a peace agreement, everyone offers you all these explanations of why this happened. But for most of the time of the negotiations, most people think this is actually going to fail. And it was possible to do it. But it was possible to do it because we started thinking and preparing really well ahead of time, and we never lost hope. So this is the main message I would like to leave, actually, that things don't happen on their own. You have to keep pushing, and you should beware. And I will say a word more about this in a second, about people who say, well, you need to meet certain conditions for negotiations. You need to have a so-called mutually hurting stalemate. Everyone needs to feel there's no way out, otherwise you're not going to have a negotiation. That may be true, but it's sometimes not true. It wasn't true in the case of Colombia. And above all, I find it's very harmful, because it introduces this idea of passivity. Let's just wait for things to play out in the battlefield or in the political field, and then we'll see whether something happens. No, that's not how it works. The way it works, if you want a result, is you need to start putting building blocks and shaping the space. And no building blocks are more important than the issue of justice and the victims' rights. So I do want to encourage you to continue these efforts and not to lose hope, even though things now may look very, very hard, and they are very hard. But that's where change comes from anticipation and preparation. So I wanted to make 3 or 4 points, and the first one, which I think I made in February in Amman, may seem like a technical thing, but I think that's actually important, and it's more a conceptual point about what are we talking about. And I understand that for the usual reasons, the phrase transitional justice is very established, and we all talk about transitional justice. But I want to make a plea to start talking more about victims and victims' rights instead of talking about transitional justice. And there are a number of reasons for this. There are some, if you like, tactical reasons. So if the day comes when the guys with the guns are actually sitting down and deciding on a peace agreement and what happens in the future, you will find that taking on the issue from the victim's perspective is more productive and less threatening than saying, we're going to go with you after you with transitional justice and accountability. That was our experience. But more strategically, I think that if you take the perspective of victims and their rights, then you can be much more creative in your own definition of what you think is an adequate response to those rights in a transition. The Yemeni response, based on these rights, which are inalienable rights of victims of justice, truth, and reparations, but you need to find your own formula. So I think that if you concentrate on the victims, it gives you more flexibility to come up with your own solution. And above all, I think, again, it is, and this will be my next point, it's really very, very important to start putting victims at the center and giving them voice. And so I am all for this idea of the Victims' Day, which I think is also a better, if I may say so, better description of what you want than a Transitional Justice Day is a day where you think about the victims. So my next point is precisely the importance of preparation. And in the case of Colombia, many things happened before we actually even started talking in secret to the FARC to do with victims. And perhaps the most important one was that a law was passed on victims' rights with a very ambitious program of reparations. At the time, I think maybe still the largest in the world. The Secretary General of the UN came to Colombia for the signature, for the signing of this bill, Ban Ki-moon, in the summer of 2011. We hadn't even started secret talks with the FARC guerrillas then. And so what this did through this piece of legislation is that it consolidated the demands of the victims movement. And so when it came to talking to the FARC, when we started discussing in secret the agenda, we could say, look, you can say whatever you like. There's no way we can have a negotiation if it does not include a point on victims, because this is the issue. Everyone is talking about this. It's there. It's in the center of attention. So it wasn't just that we were so concerned about victims and that we decided to put this on the agenda, is that the work of the victims' organizations and civil society and the way it's been reflected in previous legislation created the space for us to really pressure this point and say, without this, there's no way we can have a negotiation. Again, this is the Colombian model, but I do think that anticipating and using all these elements to put pressure on taking the victims seriously, including, I know the world's changed. We're seeing things that nobody thought we would ever see before. What's going on just an hour's flight from Yemen and Gaza is absolutely unbelievable. It's in some ways the destruction of international humanitarian law. But still, things are not going to stay like that. The world will start taking more, and it is taking more note of what's going on. And all these are sources of pressure. In our case, we had to take very seriously the fact that we were signatories of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And so what we did in our case, the phrase I normally use is we used limitations as enablers. Things that seemed like there were obstacles, we used them to sort of limit the space and say, look, this is the space we have to do something. We have to come up with a solution that satisfies Article 17 of the Rome Statute. Otherwise, we're all going to have a problem, and this is not going to be stable. That was, again, in the case of Colombia. But the larger point I want to go back to again is the importance of preparation, anticipation, giving victims voice, and not falling into the wrong sequence of thinking that you have to wait for there to be a formal negotiation, for certain things to be discussed, for victims to have voice. I think you have to start well ahead and start creating the pressure. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. Now, on the particular point, my next point of victims' participation, what we did, and I sometimes say it was probably the most innovative part of the Colombian peace negotiation, was to actually have victims come and speak directly at the negotiating table. Not as negotiators, because that would be a mistake, but to give to the negotiating parties their views directly. Now, we had established a system in our negotiations whereby every time we discussed a point of the agenda, and there were 5 points of the substantive points of the agenda, one to do with rural development, one to do with victims, one to do with the issue of drugs and illicit economies, DDR, and political participation. We would ask the UN and a university to organize a large conference in Colombia to get people's views and send them to Cuba, to Havana, where we were negotiating. In a way, it was kind of a small version of the very ambitious national dialogue you ran in Yemen more than 10 years ago, 13 years ago, whenever that was. But when it came to victims, it wasn't enough. We felt it wasn't enough. So far as I know, for the first time ever, we actually agreed to have victims come and address the negotiating table directly. And victims, this is a very important point, that were not picked or selected by the negotiating parties, but by a third neutral, credible party, which in our case was a combination of the Catholic Church, the UN, and the largest public university. So we put it in their hands for them to pick the victims. And what happened was something that was transformative. Not because it changed all the substance of the negotiation, but because it made it obvious to everyone why it was that we were there sitting down trying to end the war, what this meant, and the moral responsibility we all had to put an end to this conflict. So in a way, the victims, if I may use that language, became the moral and even the spiritual center of this whole negotiation. And that was thanks to the fact that they came, and they then ended up being not all of them, because victims are not a homogeneous movement. There's no reason why they should be, but a large number of them ended up being the most important ambassadors and defenders of this negotiation. This was a very important point, because in many parts of the world, this has worked the other way around. For example, in Spain, when there was an effort to resolve the Basque problem in the 2000s, the opposition party, the PP, politicized the victims movement against any efforts at talking to the ETA, those armed groups. So there's always a risk of the victims movements being politicized. And we were aware of that. And that's why we want to make sure that they were also brought in. And lastly, my last point is then you have to come up with your own institutional response to this. And here's where things have to be different, because every country is different. They have different legal systems. Colombia is a very legalistic country with a strong judicial system that has a problem that does not extend over all of the Colombian territory, but it is very robust in let's say, most of the consolidated country. And so we had to come up with something that was credible, and that's what we came up with, this thing which you've Sada and others heard about in Bogota, about a so-called comprehensive system, where we had a truth commission. Especially, we had a new peace tribunal that issued special sentences. And we also created a unit to look for the disappeared. Now, some of these elements may be of interest in Yemen, some may be just too complex, and I wouldn't recommend to anyone to copy this, because it's a system that is too complex. But there are elements that may be useful. For example, the issue of the disappeared is, Bart mentioned it, is an issue in any conflict. And coming up with the right formula for this is not easy. There's a lot of pressure to make sure that those special units contribute to accountability. And this is important, but it has to be careful. In our case, we ended up, and we can talk about that in another occasion, coming up with a formula whereby the results of the search of a special search unit would contribute to the legal process, but it would still be an extrajudicial mechanism, so that people could talk to it without fear of being prosecuted, and so that it fulfilled its primary objective, which was a humanitarian one of looking for the missing. So that's a kind of simple example. But I think, and I will end with this, that the challenge for Yemen is to think about what would be its own model, and perhaps given the nature of the problem, not necessarily all as formal as in Colombia. It may be a more decentralized model. It may be the things you start doing now, and I will end with that. There's no time to lose. There's no time to lose. Solutions may look like they're far away, but if you start building now, if you start putting the subject on the table now, if people start becoming more and more aware that victims' rights cannot be ignored, you'll have a much better chance at success. Thank you very much.